Good morning, dear colleagues. As has already become our tradition, we meet at the beginning of the new year in order to discuss the events and outcomes of the year 2022, which was not easy and to a certain extent unique, because in 2022, profound tendencies in geopolitics, in international aspirations of the leading countries have become even more clear. These trends have been developing for decades. Naturally, our Western colleagues were trying to turn Ukraine and the situation around it into the main event for the media, as well as in politics and economics. They accused Russia of so-called aggression against Ukraine, alleging that it was the reason behind all the woes in global economy. I won't even waste my breath trying to refute these claims, because the statistics of the World Bank and the IMF, as well as the FAO and other international structures have been indicating that the crisis had been developing even before the beginning of the special military operation, and President Putin had given data about the situation in the world economy being entirely due to the selfish position of the United States and its allies. What is going on in Ukraine at the moment arose from the United States and its satellites' years-long preparation to starting a global hybrid war against the Russian Federation. And no one is even trying to disguise that. If you read statements by Western politicians, political scientists, you can easily see that for yourself. A few days ago, professor of the University of Columbia was published, and he said we were not in a cold war with Russia. He said we are in a hot war with Russia, and NATO is fighting Russia in Ukraine. These confessions are quite obvious. They are on the surface level, and it is bizarre to see various attempts to deny that. And President Milanovic of Croatia recently said that it was NATO's war. He was frank and honest when he said that. A few weeks ago, Henry Kissinger, before calling upon NATO to make Ukraine another member, in one of his most recent articles, he said that what was going on in Ukraine was a clash and competition between two nuclear powers for control over this territory. I believe it is quite clear what this was all about. That is why when our Western partners foam at the mouth, trying to prove that they had nothing to do with that, they only try to help Ukraine overcome aggression and restore its territorial integrity, they are not being entirely truthful. The amount of their military support testify that the West is banking a lot on this war against Russia. It is quite clear, because the events in Ukraine shed light on the United States' desire to seize, trying using legitimate means to strengthen its world positions, and take up illegitimate methods for ensuring its dominance. They spare no effort. It's not just what we see in Ukraine. They also destroyed all those mechanisms that the West, headed by the US, created, the mechanisms of the free market, loyal competition, free entrepreneurship, presumption of innocence, inviolability of private property. Everything that the Western globalization model was founded on has collapsed. And right now, sanctions are being used against Russia and other undesirable states simply because they refuse to comply with their ideas. But tomorrow, these sanctions can be used against any other country that refuses to blindly follow American orders. As for the European Union, I don't think we need to speak about that for a long time. The EU is now completely following the American dictate, and this process that has been fomenting for a few years has recently culminated in a joint declaration between NATO and the EU. It happened on the 10th of January, and the declaration said that NATO and the EU will use all of their economic and military means in the interests of the Golden Billion, in the interests of our 1 billion of citizens of NATO and EU countries. According to Borrell, the rest of the world is the jungle that is in the way of the development of this blossoming garden, and this jungle needs to be reformatted, needs to be turned into a colony of the new formation and get resources from them using new methods. Blackmail, demonization and sanctions, threat of use of force, those are some of the methods they use to achieve their goals. The West has taken up the policy of destroying the traditional ties between historic partners in various parts of the world and destabilization of various regions. We see it in the Balkans, in the post-Soviet space, especially if we consider the activities of the United States and its acolytes and clients in South Caucasus, and naturally everything that is going on in Ukraine that has been developing for a long time. For example, in 2004, when the first Maidan took place, European officials said for the first time, Ukraine needs to choose. Is it with the West or is it with Russia? This either-or policy has been visible in the West's policy regarding this region in a consistent manner, and those who made the wrong choice and wanted historic ties and brotherhood traditions and religious ties with Russia matter. Initially, the West would crush them. They would try to exclude them from political life. They would prosecute them. They would assassinate journalists and politicians. They would shut down media outlets if they refused to spread the official position. The police state used all means available, and right now the process is over with the silent approval of the West. And the alternative choice, either or, West or Russia, were needed to identify those who were against the West, who were not with the West. And the West started punishing these people. And let's get back to the declaration. It's an interesting paper indeed. And the EU and NATO were proclaimed to be an alliance of democracies against autocracies amid global competition. This confrontational agenda was proclaimed for the entire world to hear. And just like I have already pointed out, Europe has lost its independence. And the joint declaration explicitly states that Europeans are subjugated to NATO, essentially containing an obligation to serve American interests in geopolitical containment of Russia and China. They also proclaimed the goal that was well known to everyone, but now they put it on paper. achieving global superiority of NATO headed by the United States. NATO does not restrict itself to simply organizing Europe. During the Madrid summit that took place in June 2022, they proclaimed global responsibility of this military bloc, especially when it comes to the Asia-Pacific region, that NATO chooses to call the Indo-Pacific. Here the attempt is clear. They are trying to involve India in this process in order to further complicate their relations with China. Moreover, they also proclaimed indivisibility of security in the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific. A play upon words. Previously, in the OSCE and the Russia-NATO Council, starting from 1990s, we would speak about indivisibility of security, which meant equal security for each state, and the obligation not to strengthen your security at the expense of the security of others. This term is now used out of context and has taken on a new meaning: the indivisibility of security interests of NATO and the Indo-Pacific. The difference is clear for everyone. The so-called Indo-Pacific, the West has embarked upon the path of creating a bloc against Russia and China. In order to do that, they have been consistently destroying various mechanisms and cooperation mechanisms that have been created in ASEAN on the basis of equality, consensus, balance of interests. They substitute them with military blocs. AUKUS is a bright example of that, an Anglo-Saxon bloc in Asia, the US, the UK, and Australia. They actively involved Japan in this bloc, and Prime Minister Kishida's recent visit to Washington became the culmination of this policy. Japan has once again embarked upon the path of militarization. They are going to change and amend its constitution, in particular the articles that prevented it from doing that. The process has started. I'm not going to go into detail about the activities of the West at other geopolitical tracks, but speaking briefly about the position of the United States and the West that we consider to be the main problem creating difficulties everywhere, it can be summed up as follows. Washington's line of ensuring dictate in international affairs means the following: we Americans are allowed to do whatever we want, wherever we want, even if it's at the other end of the world. We will do what we deem necessary, and you, all others, cannot do anything without our consent, even if you respond to direct threats to your securities that we create at your borders. I'm simplifying it, of course. Just like Napoleon mobilized the entirety of Europe against the Russian Empire, just like Hitler mobilized most European countries and made them fight against the Soviet Union, the US has now shaped a coalition including virtually all European countries, both NATO member states and others, including EU member states. And now they are waging a war by proxy against Russia, using Ukraine as a proxy, in order to solve the Russian matter. Just like Hitler wanted to find a final solution to the Jewish problem, they are doing the same right now. If we read statements by politicians, not only from Baltic states, but also some more moderate ones, they say that Russia needs to be defeated on the strategical level. Political scientists from various media outlets speak about decolonizing Russia, alleging that Russia is too big and is in the way. A few days ago, I read an article published in The Telegraph calling upon the world to liberate Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria, leaving Karelia, Königsberg and Kurils up to negotiations. Of course, it's a tabloid, and sometimes we are forced to read such tabloids because they make headlines from time to time, but no one in the West, and such remarks are very numerous, including in our non-systemic opposition, no one among Western politicians refutes such claims.
President Macron, in addition to his project of European political community, which has been directly proclaimed to be the format where all Europeans, except for Ukrainians and Belarusians, will be invited to. Now I've heard a new idea that he pitched to call a European State Conference. An invitation will be received by the EU, Eastern Partnership participants, that is Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, as well as Moldova, Ukraine, and Belarus. I doubt that they will invite Belarus. Still, it was said it would be the EU, Eastern Partnership countries, plus, and I'd like to point it out here, immigrants from the Russian Federation, which are actively engaged in politics abroad. Also, it was said, not in the presentation by President Macron, but in the comments that followed later, that this event, the Conference of the European States, could also invite separate regions of the Russian Federation, which intend to maintain their ties with Europe. I think it's clear what we're talking about. The situation is far from black and white as it is painted by our Western colleagues. It reflects the general line towards global dominance, an absolute submission of everyone, with a threat of punishment, as you can see. None of the Western politicians is talking about nothing but sanctions. Right now in Davos, Ursula von der Leyen, yet again, was threatening us and Belarus with new sanctions. We know how to introduce more sanctions, how to suffocate Russian economy, for it to be brought back into recession for decades. That's what we are talking about. Well, there is a saying that the masks are off, and for the longest time, when there were discussions at the UN Security Council about sanctions, about a country which would probably violate their international obligations, and at that point, every time the Western countries who initiated these sanctional measures, they were saying that the sanctions are not for punishing the nation, the population of a state. These are sanctions against the regimes. So where are these assurances now? The sanctions against Russia are openly declared to be aimed at the people conducting a revolution against the current leaders of Russia. No holds are barred. No one is observing any politeness rules here anymore. Well, this frenzied attempt and this response, by hook or by crook, using barred holds to ensure the domination of the U.S. and the rest of the world, the rest of the West that Washington has completely steamrolled over. This frenzy shows that historically they're acting on the wrong side of history, and in essence are trying to stop the formation of the multipolar world. And that is not happening by decisions from cabinets in Potomac or on the Potomac River or well, this is happening just naturally because countries are developing economically. Take China, take India, our strategic partners. Look at Turkey, Brazil, Argentina, Egypt, many other countries that have great potential. For example, in Africa, they have tremendous reserves of raw materials. There are new centers of economic growth being formed, and the West is trying to hinder that using the mechanisms that were created to serve their interests through the globalization that was created by them. And here, the role of the dollar as a reserve currency has one of the main roles to play. Therefore, now, in our context with the SCO and within BRICS and other associations, CIS, naturally, Eurasian Economic Union as well as then with cooperation with associations with Asia, Africa, and Latin America, they are trying to build new forms of interaction so as not to depend on the West. And it's clear, neo-colonial methods. President Putin has spoken about that very clearly. These methods are being used to plunder the rest of the world now in new conditions. We, together with our reliable partners, with friendly countries, will build such interaction that would benefit us and will be exempt from the influence from those who would like to subjugate the rest of the world. These are my evaluations of the past year. The main thing is that the processes that this year saw, they were incepted many years ago. It wasn't yesterday. And these processes will continue to unravel because the shaping of the multipolar world, its finalization of the relations that are required for democracy in the world and justice to reign in the world, for the UN Charter to be observed about respect for sovereign equality of all states, that would take time. The UN Charter is a great foundation. When it was adopted, it was indeed a revolutionary document. Unfortunately, all those right principles were distorted by the West. The West did not respect the sovereign equality principle. They did not respect non-interference in domestic affairs principle, peaceful settling of disputes, and so on. Hundreds of times after the UN was created, the U.S. have used their armed forces abroad, in the majority of cases in blatant violation of the UN Charter. Therefore, the process of multipolar world taking shape will take time. That will be a whole historical era. Right now, we're in the middle of this process. Sometimes it's hard to see when you're inside the process. Therefore, we keep in touch, we exchange opinions and evaluations, and we appreciate that. That goes not only to our partners in foreign countries, but also to our colleagues from the media. Your observations and even the questions that you're asking us are very useful. So let's move on to your questions then. RIA Novosti, please.